Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with my buddy John Thatamanil, and it's Paul Tillich Day. Nothing says Advent like getting to talk to JT about PT on the internet. So I'm pretty excited, and thank you, and welcome to all of you joining live or watching later. But if you're watching later, you probably shouldn't put any questions that come up in the chat because, well, then we won't be able to read them and answering unless you just want to perform a question for yourself. But if you're joining live and then a question comes up, something from the reading or the discussion or the lecture, then type question in bold and then put your question in so I can mark it. If you're joining live and you say to yourself, whoa, what lecture is this that John Thatamanil gave introducing Paul Tillich's thought, his understanding of Kairos, thinking about Advent? Well, then you might have missed it. And if you haven't joined up on the class and you want to go get his lecture along with intros to Bonhoeffer, Barth, and Bultmann, then head over to ohgodwhatnow.net. Oh God, like O-H. ohgodwhatnow.net. Very fun URL. And it will send you right to a place you can join up and you'll be able to get everything right there. So, yeah, John, this is fun. And I absolutely loved your lecture. It definitely inspired questions. So, and one of them's a fun one that I think might be a way for you to introduce yourself.
All right.
And and it was like I've heard John on the podcast before. I love hearing him tell stories about his own faith journey and things. Let's see. Janine asked about when John met Paul Tillich and at what point, as a thinker, he became someone who you've wrestled with throughout your work.
Well, that is a great question. It requires me to get into some autobiographical details. So, I had a very unusual and excellent high school English teacher, and name's Strunk, but no relation to the distinguished Strunk and White of the Elements of Style. Though I did spend some time in high school wondering, and eventually had the courage to ask him. But Strunk taught in one of his courses existentialism through literature. So we read things like Sartre's No Exit. I forget what from Camus. It was a fantastic way to activate the life of the mind, but largely through existentialism in its most accessible literary means. And at that point, I was pretty much convinced that existentialism was an atheist phenomenon. But then I got to college at WashU, and I met a professor named William Caspery. And he listened to me, and I told him that I was Christian and took my faith pretty seriously. And then I must have mentioned something about my exposure to existentialism. And then he said to me, "Well, John, have you heard of Paul Tillich? He's a Christian existentialist." And my mind was blown because I didn't think that there was such a category. Like, this must be a contradiction in terms. And that was my first conscious and self-aware encounter with Paul Tillich. And then I started reading his stuff, and I've not really looked back in many ways. But even younger, in my early teens, one of my priests from my Indian Christian church was doing his PhD at Union Theological Seminary, where I now work. And I cannot swear that I didn't hear Tillichian ideas in sermons. As grad students are wont to do, to preach like whatever they're hearing in their seminary classroom. So I have to add this coda that it might have started even earlier. So
Well, when I was in undergrad, we had a guest preacher at mandatory chapel, like Jesus desired his disciples to do, who just lifted a Paul Tillich sermon and proceeded to perform it. and accept the fact you're accepted, and I was just sitting there going, I've heard this. Wait, I know this. And do they think no one in the entire room's gonna know that they just stole a sermon? But as we had a number of people point out, Tillich is both a quite precise philosophical theologian when he's making very specific distinctions, and a rather compelling preacher. There were a couple questions actually came in from other clergy who wanted to know how thinking with someone like Tillich changes the way you reflect on the preaching task during Advent, or talking about the incarnation in general. What does kind of spending time with him, how does that help you understand what you're doing during the Advent season?
Well, I think I could make accessible the text or even the video or audio of my sermon last Sunday, second Sunday of Advent, which was very informed by Tillich, and I obsessed over what only a Tillichian would obsess about, namely how meticulously Luke situates in historical context the message of John the Baptist in order to situate the coming of Jesus the Christ. He names all the emperors and the regional governors, and makes it clear that historical time matters. And of course, for me, that's why Tillich thinks about history as being essential to Christian faith. He wants to say that Christian faith is marked by its distinctive concern with historical time. And of course, writing as he is in the 30s, he's aware of other religious traditions who are not concerned about historical time, but are more concerned about a kind of direct encounter outside of time or above time with the ultimate in mystical inward experience. And temporality, he says, to those traditions just doesn't matter. Now, I think that could be wrangled with, but there's also just something to it, right? If you're wanting to encounter or recognize that you are the ultimate, and that's just something that's eternally true, then thinking about the texture of historical time is not going to be a primary importance. Of course, for Tillich, this means that in some sense Christianity is better in his early moments, but I think he gets subtler later on. So thinking about the meaning of history, I mean, thinking about the fact that, in creedal churches, we say crucified under Pontius Pilate, right? Every week, right? It's odd that I have to name our Lord's executioner every Sunday, but it's also a way in which my faith clearly is determined by the structure and shape and contingencies. Like, this really happened in this particular moment under this particular person. And Advent time calls us to a kind of acute mindfulness of history. So I hope that's a start. I mean, in answering the fantastic question, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think enables Tillich to one of the reasons his theology's been so compelling to people wrestling with Scripture after you kind of move beyond a kind of early Protestant or anti-modern vision of biblical inspiration is his vision of the God world relationship, this relationship of the conditioned, historical reality, and the unconditioned, is one where the text and witnesses of the people of Israel and the early church are pointing to something that happened in history, and that those texts are a faithful witness to possibilities that are just structurally there because God and the world have this ongoing a relationship of the conditioned and the unconditioned. And so there's this sense that when you grow beyond a kind of naivete about biblical history as something kind of to be protected and defended as absolute and over with, and see it as an orientation towards history and the narratives of those who have faithfully responded to the event and rupture and arrival or seizing of the divine in their own time, then Scripture is performing what you as the church we hopefully perform in our own time as we wrestle with the text and the witness and the legacy.
Yeah, we get a kind of attunement to being skilled readers of history. And we do so under the knowledge that time is rooted in and potentially transparent to eternity, not automatically and by default, right? So he and Barth are in agreement that not everything that happens in time is somehow God's will, or that history itself is somehow the divine life worked out in some kind of Hegelian way. No, there's always a kind of yes and no that Tillich wants to assert. Of course, he thinks that Barth is all no and insufficient yes. We can get into that if we want, but the kind of potential permeability of every moment in time to its eternal ground, right? That's the logic that gets that Kairos article going, and so much of his theology. Of course, he doesn't think that there's anything whatsoever, time, history, any tree or bush, anything whatsoever can become transparent to that in which it is rooted, and from which it cannot be ontologically separated. So everything belongs and could become uh, uh, a gateway into an encounter with divinity. So hence, that's the basis of his theology of culture and also his theology of history. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder if you could say a bit about kind of like that the bigger vision or Tillich's ontology. There are a couple of questions about it because in the article he uses. I mean, there are certain words he just uses throughout all of his corpus, and I imagine when given how popular he became, it's not too much of an ask to assume you've read something before. But at work in the article we read and seeing it performed in the sermon is that relationship of the unconditioned and conditioned existence. And you also see like in other places where he develops his concept of symbol, that kind of vision for what the potential of the depth kind of erupting in the finite or the conditioned existence. Can you kind of paint the picture for how he sees this vision in contrast to a lot of to kind of maybe other visions of God, so that when we start to look at his vision for history, we see it kind of exemplifying the larger picture.
Right. I mean, I think the key is, or a key is to recognize just how stridently Tillich thinks that any talk about God as being outside time, outside nature, outside history, and entering it in just one moment, in just Jesus the Christ, as a stone thrown into history, as a tangent touching a circle, that all of those discourses of God as being elsewhere and entering within, he finds it deeply problematic and limiting. So, step one, recognize that this discourse of God as somehow an alien other that is somewhere else, Tillich will have no usefulness for that kind of discourse. But as I've already indicated, you can't just identify the finite with the infinite. That would be idolatry. And Tillich is insistent, I would say as insistent as Barth is, that any attempt to simply equate the finite and the infinite would be a disastrous mistake. In fact, so much of his theology is idolatry critique, right? In fact, he thinks that that's theology's primary purpose, or a primary purpose, is to blast the idols. So you can't have the possibility of blasting the idols if the finite and the infinite are simply, in every sense, identical. All right, so now we've established the two extremes between which you have to find a way through. And Tillich's way through is to say the finite is only because it participates in the infinite. Right? It's given being by being itself, which is a language that he begins to deploy famously in much of his career. Beings are not being itself, but beings cannot be apart from being sustained by being itself. Beings participate in being itself. So, and then, of course, behind all of this, there is the famous medieval theologian Nicholas of Cusa, who insists that, the infinite cannot be simply other than the finite. If the infinite were simply other than the finite, it would be limited by the finite. So Cusa comes up with this famous phrase that God is not other, not hyphen other. So you've got in Tillich a theologian who's willing to say the finite is not the infinite, but the infinite is not other than the finite, right? And you almost have to see that sort of written out and mapped on a board to sort of figure out what he is trying to pull off here, which is a kind of really delicate and deeply rooted in medieval theological traditions way of talking about the relationship of the finite and the infinite. But I hope that, despite the somewhat abstract way of putting it just now, I hope that is beginning to be intelligible.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things, that you raised there that I've always really enjoyed about Tillich is that he takes that criticism of idolatry seriously. And every time I get to read Tillich, and bring him up in a classroom, I find just reading Luther and from the Large Catechism, where he answers the question, what is it to have a God? What is God? Is Luther's question. Now, Tillich is like, in his mind, like Luther dialed up to 11, right? Like, part of what Tillich's doing is going like, there's this Protestant insight, and you see it at work in our essay. And then what happens when Protestantism thinks it's an end in of itself and not a servant to the energy in it? It's called idolatry. And so Luther says this, and if I'm going to read it, and then you play Tillich as to what Tillich hears, because it's a fun game for class, especially if you're teaching at Luther in January, like I am. A God is that to which we look for all good, in which we find refuge in every time of need. To have a God is nothing else than to trust and believe him with our whole heart. As I've often said, the trust and faith of the heart alone make both God and an idol. If your faith and trust are right, then your God is the true God. On the other hand, if your trust is false and wrong, then you have not the true God. For these two belong together, faith and God. That to which your heart clings and entrusts itself is, I say, really your God.
I mean, that is astonishingly Tillichian, if I want to use that, what is the word, anachronistic way of putting it. This is exactly what Tillich is translating into his discourse of ultimate concern. Right? Whatever is your ultimate concern becomes God for you. But not everything that becomes your ultimate concern is God proper. And that distinction needs to be deeply understood. I am so tired of a certain kind of facile British person. I mean, they're brilliant theologians, John Milbank, Rowan Williams. They'll all caricature Tillich on the basis of this first half of what he says and what Luther says, that whatever is your ultimate concern becomes God for you. And it's as though they don't read any of Tillich, because he then says, but not everything that has that role deserves to.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that ought to be your ultimate concern is that which is a matter of your being or your non-being. And the idols make that claim. They pretend that your existence and your flourishing depend on them, but they bring you to self-destruction. So the only proper object of ultimate concern is God, who is the true ultimate. And I don't understand why Tillich's functional definition of religion isn't recognized as just a way of getting started. He's not somebody who just blesses everything as a kind of anything that becomes God for you is God. That's just facile.
Mm-hmm. Now, I wonder if part of the problem when people read Tillich is that they have the kind of revelational narrowness that Karl Barth has, right? That we even see challenged in the Kairos essay when he gives his brief mention of Barth. It's like he's like, yeah, the Barth's idolatry hunt, great. But also when he gets done, I'm not sure he's ever had God show up in history. He just has one little moment and says, this is where the contact happens, the tangent. And I think it's helpful for people to get that for, what Luther's talking about there is faith, a faith as trust, faith as like what you give yourself to at this kind of existential register. And that's not something you assent to like an idea, like I believe these things. So what do you give yourself to? There are plenty of us who our energy gets given to the need for accumulation and or economic drives. There are one where what do you give yourself to as a vision of the state or the populace or a people. You can get these kind of collective senses, which in the courage to be, he talks about this courage to be a part of something. And it can, when you want to be a part of some community, but the community isn't the whole of existence, and it's ultimately idolatrous. And he gives Nazis. I mean, you just go ahead and go through a list, right? He said, but then religious people also confuse some contingent finite thing with the unconditioned. And they're like, well, it's the Bible, or it's the creeds, or it's my particular religious tradition. And you can just imagine him sitting there going like, no, there's not an infallible poem. Like, that's just not how poems work. Poems aren't infallible. Like when you tell a love poem, it's not the love poem itself that bears the authority of being seized by love. It's the actual lover who deserves the poem and elicits the poetic response. That's how it works, right? And so he wants to go like a doctrine, a form of the church, or a form of politics, or a document that is religious or political, or any form of economic exchange. Any of these things are contingent, and they're idols if you think what was getting itself done in them is themselves, that they're the end in and of themselves. And that's even, because there's been a couple questions in here already in the chat about Jesus. Like, that's even one of the reasons for Tillich, when he's thinking about Christology, that there's something very specific going on, that there's always this principle of continuity and discontinuity in his thought. And so insofar as like structure of being is descriptive of the nature of God and humanity, right? This description of the relationship of the conditioned and unconditioned, then there's continuity between God and humanity. But insofar as the depth of God transcends a structure of being, or to the extent that God's not determined by that structure, there's a discontinuity between nature, humanity, and God. So revelation make both principles necessary. Like if you want revelation, both have to be necessary, right? And this is something in the lecture you contrasted with that root imagery versus a rock hitting. So unless there's continuity between humanity and God, you can't have revelation at all. But without discontinuity, without a disclosure of the unconditioned, the depth dimension, then you aren't getting an encounter with ultimacy. And so in Christology, God and humanity meet decisively, and he's in Jesus as the Christ. And so that structure of being is essentially exemplified amid, and he emphasizes these existential distortions of humanity and history. So one finds in Jesus as the Christ the incarnate divine depths of the structure of being, and yet it's in that continuity and discontinuity that Jesus, in the fullness of his humanity, is transparent to this unconditional depth. God's majesty becomes correlative with humanity's finitude, and he wants to sit there and go, that's what the creeds were talking about, unless you just think the metaphysics of the words they used are what they idol. I mean, the truth is, and so like I just say this because so many people, I think the moment they go, well, Tillich wants to make everything a religion, the next thing they go, well, is there anything different about Jesus than any other person? And I'm just like, well, yeah. And he's not even dismissing the particularities of Jesus, precisely because it's in conditioned existence that God ever shows up. God is not an abstraction. You can't abstract God from existence and talk about God. It's because then all you're using are symbols and concepts humans came up with. And you know what those are? Things we made. And when we make God, they're called idols.
Yeah, Tillich is a very subtle thinker on this point, and it's useful to remember his rubric of Protestant principle and Catholic substance. And I think if you forget that he is trying to be profoundly Catholic and profoundly Protestant, you don't really get him. The Protestant principle is the principle that insists that when God discloses God's self to any human, anything that the one who is the recipient of revelation tries to receive will find a fallible expression, right? I mean, it's us that is receiving revelation. And it is us as conditioned by history, by circumstances, by the vocabularies we use, by our own fallibility. And so, yes, revelation really heals. Yes, revelation is divine disclosure, but the recipients remain putzes, to use a technical Tillichian term. And so this is the basis for the Protestant principle, right? Beware the impulse to absolutize. So if you try to erect a kind of infallibility around any site of real revelation, say, for example, the institution of the Catholic Church, you're giving up the game. You're going to lose the possibility of the divine no to all the ways in which we try to bespeak what happens to us in the event of revelation. But that no cannot be so strident that it sort of evacuates all of time and history and renders it God abandoned. Right? Time and history are not God abandoned. And he insists that it is as terrible to identify history with the divine life as it is to say that history is God abandoned, except for this one moment. And both mistakes are dreadful and devastating theologically. And the yes is the Catholic substance. It is a way of saying that time and history and culture can become sites of transparency to the divine. So there's a real yes and a real no.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't say both, you haven't done dialectic theology. And that's his criticism of Barth. Barth's all nine. It's all no and no yes. And there are, on the Catholic side, the temptation to say a yes that has no hanging over it.
Mm-hmm.
It's Catholic substance, but no Protestant principle. So you've got to have both. You've got to have both. And that means the spirit is, as he puts it, the human spirit is not ever an answer. It's not ever its own revelation, but the longings and yearnings of the human spirit, the questions that the human being asks, those questions are crying out for an answer. And the yearning of the human spirit for a divine answer is itself activated by the divine. So, insofar as the human can, has at all times asked after God, that is always already a testimony to the work of God in the human spirit. So the yearning question is God driven, but the answer still must come, if I can use the phrase from a Barthian perspective, from the outside, in the sense that the human can't manufacture the answer. But of course, the outside is a bad spatializing of transcendence. God is not, as I love to say, like Bette Midler's, watching us out, somewhere from a distance. I normally sing that in karaoke, but I'll leave the
Well,
singing today. I'm not feeling like in good voice. So.
all right. Well, that yes and no there, that that's intimately connected to his whole vision of theology, oftentimes called, like correlation, where this existential despair of humanity meets the ground of its source, God, in response. And I mean, even there, you see that element of continuity and discontinuity again, that I think shows up in both of the readings, both in thinking about history and culture, like how there is this ongoing continuity of the movement of history, but then there are these transformative moments and encounters where something new arrives, and there's this discontinuity that reorients. But when those moments of discontinuity happen, when these ruptures happen, the goal is a reorientation towards possibilities that are gifted, graced, and such in the moment, where history doesn't, in a sense, birth its own horizon in totality. And one of the things that I find striking is that for Tillich, like humanity and nature and God, when yes, they're all involved in the structure of being, but God is the structure of being, and God's not subject to it or determined by it.
Yeah.
He is God is the inexhaustible depth within the structure. So humanity, nature, history participate in the structure of being. And one, like, even when you're talking about these questions of despair, the yearnings for justice, and these kind of challenges that show up, those questions, Tillich wants to say, are part of the dignity of being human.
Yes.
Right? Like you have the wonderful gift of, like, if you think of like how Tillich would talk about the Imago Dei, is you exist as addressed. To be human is to be questioned. To live in your finitude, in the contingent world where you found yourself, will elicit questions if you open yourself up to it. One's about beauty and justice and truth. Questions where you know where you found yourself is not the answer, and yet everywhere you found yourself is the very vessel where those questions get provoked. Right? Like this is the context of history, and those questions, despair, anxiety, injustice, the struggle, all those things are the dignity of being made in the image of God. Like, to be human is to be addressed. So if you want to chuck your answers or sell them to an apologist or a reductive materialist, then you're missing out on the dignity of being human. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about Tillich is he takes so seriously the human as the site of a divine address that trite, flippant answers, be it religious or secular, are just not worth the dignity of our finitude. They aren't worth giving our allegiance to it, right? And hence, they're idols. And so, like, there are a couple questions around this about how this vision that Tillich is asking, like, what was going on in his own history and in looking in the his own time through the wars and coming to America, where a philosophy of history is a live debate question. Because Homeboy creates a typology. It's obviously a popular conversation that he's picking up in modernity. But when Tillich shows up with his kind of theological picture in mind, what are the bad answers to a philosophy of history in the moments in history that are demanding it? Like, it's a question people have at that time. And it's kind of like he needs to reintroduce the depth dimension entailed in their questions for them to wrestle with it.
Oh, it's a fantastic question. And man, I would trust you to preach a Tillichian sermon any day. It's one of my assignments that I give to my students in my Tillich class. I ask them to figure out how this feels homiletically after having read some of his, but then also to generate a meaningful Tillichian sermon for their historical context and time and cultural location.
Well, I think my teenager would like for me not to generate one when he just asks a question. And I'm like, that is a great question. And
yeah.
I want to go to bed, Dad.
So so many of the past lectures in the series have named the historical factors that so well that I don't have to belabor the matter. I can move pretty quickly. I think every one of the theologians that you are exploring in this crisis Advent series are feeling the crisis of World War I intensely. And for Tillich, oh my God, I mean, he experienced this in the trenches of Verdun. And as I mentioned in my lecture, over 300,000 died. Tillich is performing mass burials in the trenches, engaging in historic work, courageous work in the middle of battle. I gather, like, trying to rescue people. But there in the trenches, you see the end of any account of history that tells history as an ongoing ascent to ever better. Right. A progressive account of history that says that history is just a straight line, neatly ascending until it arrives at the kingdom of God. That would be the kind of blessing of kind of modernist imagine. Oh, we've become enlightened now. We've become scientific now. We've learned how to engage in rational reflection now. And, it's just going to get, getting better all the time, as the song goes, right? Talk about a shattering, that absurdity of that war. And Tillich, having suffered, as they said back in the day, nervous breakdowns, but clearly having traumatic and post-traumatic episodes. This blows up any sort of evolutionary account of history. And he points out in this Kairos article that there are evolutionary accounts being told by religious people and by secular people. Auguste Comte tells it as a secular story of how we move from the mythical to the I think it's the religious to the ethical or something like that, right? There's always some story of just onward ever better that is smashed to pieces in the carnage of battle. And of course, in Barth, this was the absurdity of all this was seen when Barth's own teachers endorsed, unbridled nationalism and patriotism, and so it's like, well, any theology that can just sort of produce this kind of misguided reading of history is just not worth credence, right? So in that sense, there's a real sharing between the figures at this time, particularly Tillich and Barth, and Tillich, really coming to recognize all of this in the thick of battle. It's also worth remembering, of course, that when Tillich talks about socialism and the needs of working people, he's got real experience, right, in the trenches. So his advocacy for working classes, again, is formed in the hell, in the maw of warfare, and it motivates his commitment to religious socialism, as he so powerfully advocates for in what we read. So I would say that that's the basic historical context. Hegelianism, secular Comte, C-O-M-T-E, Comteanism, all of these ways of singing history's praises as though history would deliver the kingdom by its own forward march goes to pieces. But, and here's the distinction from Barth. It's one thing to bless history and say it is this constant mark of progress, but it's another thing to empty it out of divine presence and activity. And Tillich says, of course, that Barth and the Barthians do make the second error, because then the possibility that history could become transparent to divinity is evacuated too. History is the site of nothing but God-forsakenness, as I mentioned earlier, and that's terrible. Tillich points out, both at the end of his life, literally in his last lecture, and in his early writings, like the ones we just read, that you can't even say the word Messiah or Christos if those words were unavailable to you, if history was itself not in some way already a site of anticipation, of even blessed words of divine disclosure that make possible even the terms of our longing. Christianity has nothing in and of itself apart from what it has to say about the crucified being the new being. But if even to say that, you need the vocabulary of other religious traditions. And he points out that this includes the whole religious landscape of the ancient Near East. So our language to bespeak what is happening in Jesus itself is historically prepared. And that's prepared because God has always been disclosing God's self in and through, of course, most particularly the life of ancient Israel. But even ancient Israel's religious life requires the ambient presence of the religious life of other ancient Near Eastern communities. So neither God abandoned nor itself sacred, but always transparent to divine activity that prepares for what he says is the final revelation in Jesus the Christ.
Mm-hmm. So one of one of the kind of essential contrasts for understanding his vision of history here is between Kronos at Kronos time, where
Yep.
and could you kind of like just kind of introduce that, because there were a number of lingering questions around it.
Yeah. The exquisite feeling, I think he says, that the Greek language has for two senses of temporality, chronology being just clock time, right? As in, well, the word chronology, uh, the way we measure time through our clocks, right? And another sense of time as time pregnant with possibility, time full of promise and potentiality. And of course, this notion of kairos doesn't just come from anywhere. It comes particularly from the preaching of John and Jesus. Right? The kingdom of God is at hand is what Paul Tillich means by kairos, right? Here, now, time has this possibility of something emerging, something unanticipatable, and yet intuited and felt by the human who is under the impress of the spirit, right? So Tillich says you can only ever proclaim a kairos under the power of the spirit. It's already in some sense a kind of feeling for a particular time as being pregnant with possibility. And the time that is pregnant with possibility is the kairos time. And of course, the kairos time is the time of the Christ, the time of Jesus. But we can then see whether there might be other kairoi in the plural, where something like the divine possibility might be felt. And he thought there was one in that intermediate time between World War I and World War II. Just then, he thought we have the possibility of another kairoi, another interruption and eruption of divine possibility into history. And of course, he said, of course, this never materialized. He grieves that the possibility of the kairos he hoped, intuited, and felt didn't come to be on account of multiple failures. But we look for kairoi only under the guidance of that original kairos.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we get the very notion that certain times can be more transparent to the divine life than others, and that other times can be fallow times, times where it just doesn't feel like something qualitatively new can break into and open up in history and make it transparent to the divine impress.
Yeah, one of the things, and I feel like it's in his systems of science, but I don't. Well, it's in my head attached to Paul Tillich, so who knows? Um, but one of the things I remember him saying at some point when he's talking about Kronos time is that it generates an explanatory logic for history when you're looking at history. So in this essay, he talks about why did historians who understand history and could talk about these other transformative times never see their own time as this moment? Because they're looking at history like Kronos. And he's doing this bit talking about science where he's like, yeah, in Kronos time, all you have to do is talk about mass and motion and duration. And mass, when you're talking about the mass of something, you're only talking about it as an object. When you're talking about the motion of it, you're inscribing the energy of existence. When you're talking about duration, and especially at this point, science has changed a bit. It's very much faded, right? Determined. And for him, when you look through the essay, there are these elements that that there's a kind of natality of certain moments in history where something new is birthed. Uh, Seems appropriate for Advent. And it's ones, right, where it's not the elimination of Kronos relationship of objects, but the objects have a new orientation to the depths. It's not the elimination of energy, but the possibilities available to them. It's not it's not the disordering of causality, but it is the harnessing of the freedom of the spirit within it, right? And so there's this kind of imaginative closure that modernity, even though it's the one that kind of modern Western cultures discovered history of sorts, but now modernity is has sought to control history, that it's kind of like bifurcated nature. It's narrowed the things that matter only to that which it can control and diagnose. So both in the sermon and in this essay, you see a kind of constant pushback to what would amount to the logic of, in our own context, we might say something like the neoliberal logic. So in the Protestant era, when he says, and this is when he's talking about how the West gave birth to anti-historical logic, he goes, an opponent issuing from the mystical view of the world, okay, nourished by the naturalistic attitude and shaped by the rational mathematical method of thinking, the technical mathematical explanation of the world by means of natural science, the rational conception of reality as a machine with eternally constant laws of movement, manifest an infinitely reoccurring and predictable natural process. Right? So this modern imaginary, social imaginary, makes history an engineering problem.
Yep.
That's calculable. And guess what what never is an engineering problem? The dignity of being addressed, the depth dimension of existence. And so he has this constant tension of going like, I don't want to chuck out the gains of these things. But when you cut the book of nature in half and then pretend the only part of it that exists is the conditioned part and not its intrinsic relation to the unconditioned, then you aren't going to answer the questions that matter most. And history will just be running off on its Kronos time, pregnant with possibilities it can't open up to.
Yeah, and I also think that there's a kind of an intuition that human life with time, a kind of, sorry to drop the word, phenomenological sense of how time feels to us is and never can be exhausted by this mechanical sense of what time is, right? So any attempt to empty time into just a kind of container where this happens and then this happens and this happens violates how time actually feels to us when we experience temporality from a first person or even a communal perspective, right? We don't just feel time in this emptied out way, but under the tyranny that the only knowledge that's worth anything is scientific knowledge. Then you fall back into an ahistorical view of temporality as just empty clock time. And he thinks this would be devastating, right? It's actually losing historical sensibility after we gained it. That historical consciousness is a precious thing. And then, of course, the fact is that under capitalist capitalist time also feels like something, right? It isn't just clock time. It feels like a kind of endless accelerationism where everything happens faster and has to happen faster. So even the way we talk about time under scientific analysis doesn't actually capture how time feels for us in the captivity of this ever accelerating neoliberalism that requires constant productivity at all hours, at all moments in the day. So, yeah, you've got to have a thicker account of how time feels, and that's not unscientific, right? That's not somehow purely subjective. This is where the divine might show itself, right?
Yeah, and that, what's fascinating to me is the way in which his vision or understanding of time, like one of the pieces of it he picks up right from the substance or the Catholic vision. He observes in the history of Christian theology, his lectures, where he's like, look, we got rid of a calendar. There used to be a lot of feast days. You know what happened on feast days? Workers didn't work. They enjoyed the commons. We used to have feast days all the time. Soldiers didn't kill on feast days when everyone was a part of the mother church. And he names these things. And what did Protestantism do? There's this gains in Protestantism, but then it secularized all time that wasn't sacred, and then gave over to it the engine of the market. Right. So part of, say, like his religious socialism, which he talks about at the end of this, but in the socialist decision, is to say, well, Protestantism has this breakthrough, but then it gave unto you have your individual is religious and you have the Sabbath, but outside of that, all of a sudden nature becomes a resource, your labor becomes a human resource, all of your time becomes available to the market. Now that we got caffeine and lights, more time becomes available. Now that you have a device that your anxieties can be monetized in your pocket all the time. Well, now your attention is being harvested, right? Like even what time feels like for Tillich is something that there is something in the past that was lost, and it was lost over this really good insight. But now we've missed the point. Like we used to have feast days, because even a feud where you knew you were going to kill each other the next day couldn't happen on that day. Like, was that a gain? So just thinking of all the ways he picks up, like, there's a phenomenology of these deep rupturous moments, but even in a society that's more theonomous, you use his word, it made habit and law to instantiate a reverence that where there are times and there are relationships, there are all these spaces that aren't subject to demands of the market and such.
Brilliant. He says in this lecture this lovely line that that the Protestants were right when we said, or they said, I forget precisely how he puts it, that every day is the Lord's day. But that also evacuated the Lord's day of its special significance. And if you don't mark the Sabbath, if you don't recognize that there are special times and places that can become transparent, especially to the sacred, then time itself becomes flat. And the idea that that a particular time can be sacramental or particular places can become sacramental then evacuates time and place itself of divine impress, and everything becomes empty in precisely the ways that you just beautifully put it. And then we have real problems, right? Tillich is acutely aware that when you evacuate time and nature of transparency to the sacred, you're about to lose your religion and have it be transformed into a kind of moral club. Protestantism as do-goodism, right? And then you don't have the religious anymore. You got your book club on Sunday morning, and you hang out with your other lefty inclined people if you're at certain kinds of church, and righty inclined friends if you're another kind of. And this is not religious life anymore. There's nothing sacramental happening. There's no encounter with God. And that, yeah, you think that's bad for the way it flattens out everything. But the spirit abhors a vacuum. So the real trouble, if the flatness wasn't itself a problem, is that something will come roaring in, right? When the spirit is emptied out, the new demons will take up residence, and new new appearances of sacral claims will enter into the space that you just cleaned out of sacramentalism. And they will be things like, well, Nazism, Christian nationalism, right? The claims of divinity on behalf of nation, on behalf of market, all these things will come roaring back in, and then we are under the subjection of the principalities and powers to signal a very good question in the chat. So yeah, so this is real dangerous, right? You flattened out secularism is a vehicle for the emergence of the demonic.
So there are 3 passages more than 2 people mentioned in emails. So I'm going to read them and just let you talk whenever you want. We'll see what happens. But the questions diverge, so we'll just talk about the passage. So the first one is where he's talking about religion as lifeblood, and he says, "Religion is the lifeblood, the inner power, the ultimate meaning of all life. The quote sacred or the quote holy inflames, imbues, inspires all reality and all aspects of existence. There's no profane nature or history, no profane ego, no profane world. All history is sacred history. Everything that happens bears a mythical character. Nature and history are not separated. Equally, the separation of the subject and object is missing. Things are considered more as powers than things. Therefore, the relation of them is not that of technical manipulation, but that of immediate spiritual communion and of magical, in the larger sense of the word, influence."
Ha. I think that's the most rapturous passage in this lecture, and I'm unsurprised that that folks found that so appealing. And that's the moment when Tillich most robustly proclaims what I'm calling Catholic substance. Right. I think Tillich is trying to think after modernity, in all the ways that Tripp you just suggested. Right. If modernity is the time in which we generate the notion that religion is something that happens in the innermost sanctum of the private, and everything else now is under the iron grip of the technical rational. Tillich is trying to break that. This is why I find people who say that Tillich is somehow the arch modernist theologian, I find them insufferable, because he's trying to say something about what happens if everything is calculable, if everything is under the sovereignty of technical reason, and if the economy is handed over to the economists and state to the Hobbesians, and everything else under the particular science that insists that it has absolute sovereignty over that domain, as though now that all of these spheres of life have been emptied out, you can believe anything you want in your spare time, right? Like that's how religion functions in modernity, as a kind of, Sunday belief. It doesn't have anything to do with your bodies. It doesn't have anything to do with how the body comes together with other bodies. That's anyway an elective matter. We don't actually have any natural connections with any other bodies, right? All of this empties out everything and hands over basically almost everything in our lives, except the things we believe, to the secular powers. And here Tillich is wanting to say, no, everything whatsoever is essentially related and belongs to the divine. Time, history, nature, that is what he's saying in these rapturous passages. So you cannot understand economy, you cannot understand politics, you cannot understand culture Culture isn't much talked about here, but it's, remember his famous saying, uh, religion is the substance of culture, culture is the form of uh, religion. That goes for everything, right? Uh, Everything has a divine substance. Um, yeah, and that's what he's saying in this lovely passage.
Mm-hmm. All right. Here's another one, which my favorite was. I'm pretty sure this is his thesis. Still not sure how these words line up. He says, how can the absolute categories which characterize a genuine Kairos be united with the relativity of the universal process of history? The answer: history comes from and moves towards periods of theonomy, i.e., periods in which the conditioned is open to the unconditional without claiming the unconditional itself. Theonomy unites the absolute and the relative elements in the interpretation of history. The demand that everything relative become the vehicle of the absolute, and the insight that nothing relative can ever become the absolute itself.
Ha! Uh, we are gifted with absolutely brilliant readers. Yes, uh, that 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 is a concise summary of Tillich's hopes, right, for theonomous moments, and Kairos is the theonomous moment par excellence, where the finite becomes transparent to the infinite without ever insisting that it is itself the infinite. And this, of course, is why he thinks that the Christian message and Jesus and the cross are the theonomous par excellence, right? When anybody tries to call Jesus good, Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? Uh, no one is good but God alone." So there's a kind of even the one who's the bearer of new being is the bearer of the new being precisely because he is perpetually transparent to the ground that sustains him and with which he is imbued in the power of the Spirit. But he's always saying, I am not the absolute. And I'm thinking about Life of Brian, where Brian denies that he is the
Yeah.
Messiah. And then somebody
The
says,
Holy Gourd.
only the true Messiah denies his Messiahhood. All right, then, I am the Messiah. See, he is the Messiah. I mean, like that but that logic, seriously, of Jesus always pointing away from himself is the theonomous, right? He's fully imbued by the power of the Spirit, and yet he constantly is performing this self-negation. That's theonomy, because there the finite doesn't just bless itself, doesn't just insist that it is infinite, but it remains transparent to the infinite. This can happen in time. This can happen in culture. It can happen in particular periods. And history is sustained by those moments when something theonomous finds expression. Tillich is like the radical Orthodox bro dudes, phrase used quite intentionally, by having a certain longing for the medieval as that moment, right, where the whole of the culture was under the impress and was funded by a kind of religious power. But unlike the radical orthodoxy bro dudes who feel like they have a kind of longing to return to the medieval, to the status quo ante, Tillich is always looking for where the new manifestations of theonomy are, and is totally prepared to say that the most powerful manifestations of theonomous possibilities might come from secular forces, right? And secular, I mean, for him, there's real theonomous possibilities being sounded in the socialist movement. But of course, the minute socialism gives itself over to reductive Marxian uh, readings of inevitability and that the historical process is bound and determined to come to this particular moment, well, then socialism becomes itself, in communism, a kind of idolatrous thing. But the point of religious socialism is to say, oh, but the longing there for justice to become incarnate, that's where, in our time, the theonomous is beginning to be sounded. If we could be harnessed by religious socialists who can say, yes, 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 this longing for justice, that's right, but don't subject that longing to a kind of mechanistic determinism. Don't bless a whole class. Don't say that the proletarian will inevitably bring about an absolute future. Correct those dynamics and then root socialism in its theonomous nature, and you get the real deal, right?
Mhm.
That's the kind of move that Tillich makes. So in him, there's no longing to go back to the good old days. Time doesn't work that way.
Yeah,
History
and
doesn't
he
work that
calls
way.
that desire a religious terror.
Oh, yeah, and it often becomes that, right? Any time you start getting, make Germany great again, make America great again, you are in the grip of dire terror because you're absolutizing some sacred past, and appealing to the power of what Tillich calls the whence instead of the power of the whither.
Mhm.
Where are we headed, right? The longing should not be for some good old day, but for a future that has not yet come, for which we long.
Yeah, in the Socialist Decision, one of the elements that he emphasizes is that the materialist superstructure, if that's like the only engine of the movement, then it collapses the dignity, the very movement's demanding recognition for, right? That like the moment, the moment Kronos time is faded towards this materialist outcome, and that the engine is without freedom, dignity of the human, the depths, these kinds of things that he sees collapsed in a flattened account, then the narrative you're giving isn't thick enough for the reality you're articulating. And
Yeah, because this is a divine movement, right? It's not ever just the movement of one particular social class, even if one particular social class is more likely, and I think Tillich would absolutely agree, to be the vehicle of the Kairos. I mean, he is a deeply socialist thinker who is tutored profoundly by Marx, but and so he would want to name uh, the working class and allegiance with the working class as the call for the Christian community. But he wouldn't want to say somehow that it is that working class alone, unaided by divinity, that's going to bring about some new theonomous possibility. I wonder often, and I was wondering this trip, that I don't know why he thought that the late 50s and the 50s as a whole in the US seemed like a time in which Kairos possibilities were not there. He lived to 1965, and I wonder why he could never say or never detect the presence of an emerging Kairos in the Black freedom movement. Right? I think he missed a powerful articulation of kairotic possibilities erupting into American life in and through the work of, uh, you know, King and Ella Baker and all those, Rosa Parks. And he could
and
have
King was
proclaimed a
inspired by
Kairos.
Tillich's own thought.
Yes.
King's sitting there writing about him.
Literally, you can't understand what Tillich says about King says about love, power, and justice without Tillich's book, Love, Power, and Justice. And here he is using Tillich to sound the possibility of a multiracial emergence of a new birth of freedom that seems to me profoundly kairotic. I think Tillich is perhaps right that he doesn't have a feeling for American life. And what captures him, or what prevents him from seeing kairotic possibilities, is because he doesn't see a genuine economic left in Red Scare America. I mean, he's not wrong, right? He's not wrong that, how can you talk about religious socialism in a country like this, for goodness sake? And so he's despairing that, what he wants to sound is a real left socialism, which we still have trouble in the US articulating. It's all the communist scare if you start speaking that way. So I can see why, but there was something that was emerging all the way into, of course, the Poor People's Campaign, where King begins to sound not, just the hope for racial emancipation, but a kind of multiracial coalition for socialism. King was a socialist and outed himself as such. So, this is one of those moments in Tillich where the promise that of all the work he had laid down over decades didn't come to fruition in Tillich's own life. And this is, he remains one of my very flawed and fallible heroes. But this is one of those moments where I feel that he was quite missing in action.
Okay, so I want to do the last one. We had more than two people talk about. This is from the sermon. One, my favorite line is when he says, "When the earth grows old and wears out, when nations and cultures die, the eternal changes the garbs of his infinite being. He is the foundation in which all foundations are laid, and this foundation cannot be shaken. On the boundaries of the finite, the infinite becomes visible." Oh, come on. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But no one asked that one, and I liked it. But this one, and this is a zinger at the end. He said, "We cannot be cynical about the end only so long as we do not have to see it. Only so long as we feel safety in the place in which our cynicism can be exercised. But if the foundations of this place and all places begin to crumble, cynicism itself crumbles with them, and only two alternatives remain: despair, which is the certainty of eternal destruction, or faith, which is the certainty of eternal salvation. The world itself shall crumble, but my salvation knows no end, says the Lord. This is the alternative for which the prophets stood. This is what we should call religion, or more precisely, the religious ground for all religion." Oh, man, that's what I'm talking about. Come on, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, and in that language, you can hear why he must have been, and was regarded as a kind of preacher par excellence, right? It's something about his uncanny capacity to use what seem like technical philosophical terms, but with ecstatic power. I mean, you wouldn't think the ground of being could preach, but weirdly in his hands it does. And of course, he's not wrong, right? I mean, after all, we have that wonderful phrase where Paul in Athens is quoting Epictetus, right? God is as you say, as your own philosophers say, God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being, right? There you see ontology and the sermonic register finding a kind of groove, right? And you find that same groove here in the snippet that you cited. He's sounding the Kairos again, right? It feels like in that shaking of the foundations sermon, which is haunted by the threat of nuclear annihilation. I don't know another sermon that is so hauntingly in the grip of that very real fear. And he ratchets up that terrible possibility to the nth degree, but then ends with just the snippet that you mentioned, that right here in the thick of the horror, we find the possibility of something, right? And one is that possibility comes through because I can't just sort of like proclaim that I'm indifferent to the threat that I'm living under. Like this wakes me up. This is a moment where, akin to No Atheists and Foxholes, right? The sheer despair of this moment breaks me open from indifference and articulates the possibility of something that might come through, but not in the guise of the old, new garb. This is why I love Tillich, right? If you repeat, it's not God. Right? If you look for the medieval to come back again, it's not God. If you want traditional Christian language, that's not God. There must come a kind of new expression of the power that we name new being. And it's got to be new because it's the new being we're looking for. And new being doesn't repeat. That's what you, I think, so beautifully detect at work in that lovely passage.
One of the things I noticed in the sermon, if we go back to the beginning of the conversation in John's lecture, where he's talking about the conditioned and finite existence, and then the unconditioned and the infinite, and the structure of being, and how understanding that enables you to understand all sorts of Tillich. He's in this one sermon, which is basically an intro if you're a Baptist, right? Like you're barely started your sermon by the time he's done. This is more like a contemplative thought. The language he uses for the condition is destruction, temporal doom. It's changeable and it's faded, and it's not until you are able to move beyond, because of the prophetic truth telling, a move beyond a cynicism about conditioned existence and awaken to its destruction, to that things are shaking. In that moment, then you have to choose despair or faith, right? And then what does faith open up? And there's a whole set of correlations between the conditioned and unconditioned in the sermon. So destruction, faith opens up salvation. Why? Because if you're attached to just contingent existence, it will die. It's its job. It's in the job description of finitude to finite. But in the unconditioned, boom shakalaka, salvation. Why? Because it comes from the very source of the foundations itself. Temporal doom. If that's what your identity is attached to, if that's what your hope is in, good luck. But eternal manifestation, that's the language he uses in that in the sermon, the eternal manifestation, or this picking up of new garbs, that the destruction of anything we attach ourselves to in the present isn't the final word, because all things get seized up moment to moment in this. And then it goes, do you have this sense of the changeable? Like if you attach yourself to this, it's going to go away, but there's an unchangeable element in existence, namely that the condition is sustained and birthed and held by the unconditioned, and it is above the pay grade of finite conditioned reality to say, never mind. You can ignore it, you can get cynical, you can get to despair, but ontologically, the one that made you and knows you and holds you, that unconditioned itself, being itself, is sitting there, the very ground of things. You could be overwhelmed with this contingent nature of fate, that you're just strung out in a series of actions oriented without your own agency. But that's if you're only telling the story of conditioned existence, because the unconditioned is the birth of freedom. The freedom to bring things into being, the freedom to give things a new beginning, the freedom to move beyond faded ends to possibilities you can't imagine. Right, and what's amazing to me throughout it is he is more honest about what the prophets say in their time, and brutally honest about what the scientists who are discovering the context of like a potential nuclear holocaust and soldiers returning from war. Think of his own experience in World War II, and here students at Union coming back from World War II, and stories of the death camps, which in his letters we hear how much that shook him. Right, that those individuals are doing something for us that we would rather be cynical and avoid the truth. But when they tell it, then we no longer can be content with some story that's based on contingent existence. We have to make a decision for despair or faith. And the way he understands his vision, he's like, what word or symbol would you use to give dignity to this faith, to put yourself in, to enact in the world a kind of trust where the finite contingent reality and its destruction and despair isn't the last word? And he's like, I don't know, but I think God might be the word. God might be the word we use. And if you need another word, that's fine, because, God is just a word. It's a concept. God doesn't exist like any conditioned finite thing, but it is the word we use as one of our own creatures, our own words, to get at what gets itself done throughout history. And I would hate to make an idol of God, but I would more hate to make an idol of history and our own agency, as if we're the only ones telling our story, and that our hope and our ends are just ours to make on our own. Like, come on, that's what I'm talking about. It gets me pumped like reading Lord of the Rings at Christmas. That's what they're Tillich sermons, reading Lord of the Rings, things that just make Trip excited on the inside. And I was not the only person who, after reading this sermon, had the Holy Ghost tug, lose a night's sleep, and just read the whole thing, because the man can preach.
Yeah, he sure can. And what you so beautifully captured, and by the way, I love that we had a good boom shakalaka, because if that did not happen, I would not be talking to Trip, but a Trip imposter, a very, very nearly convincing Trip. But now I know I'm talking to the real dude here. This sermonic register is performs something very delicate. And it is, I think, in the prophetic register. How do you speak and bespeak something that you long for, that you intuit, you sense, but you can't bring into being by your own agency, right? The finite is always open to and transparent to the divine, but it's still the divine that has to show itself. And what is the preacher's and the theologian's position in this kind of fragile position? Because you mustn't bless anything finite as infinite. So what do you do? Do you just wait passively? Or do you try in the power of the Spirit to articulate a longing and attend to the dynamics of how it is that even in brokenness, there is something on the far side of that brokenness that shines itself through. That's what he's trying to do. And it's delicate work. And he says, you might make mistakes, right? You might proclaim a Kairos and it might not happen, as it failed to happen in the 20s to the 30s. Religious socialism didn't happen. The Nazis took over. Devastating realities made themselves manifest when Tillich, in his prophetic posture, longed for and hoped for, yearned for something other to emerge. But but he doesn't give up, right? And even in this possibility of nuclear holocaust, he senses and yearns for something else. Yeah, you put that rightly.
Yeah, I think what came to mind reading these and thinking about Advent is that double dialectic that he discusses towards the end of the Kairos article, that there's this horizontal dialectic of the historical process and a vertical one where the unconditioned and conditioned relationship. So in a sense, what we're waiting for, and that's going to be in the historical process a moment of Kairos, we're waiting in the vertical sense, ontologically, that we are always conditioned, is structurally connected to the unconditioned. So we're waiting in that for something that we that isn't of our own making, that happens horizontally, and it seems to me that dialectic is the kind of cross pressure of those two dialectics insists that it resists cynicism and it resists despair, and then it resists utopianism, and so like faith in some sense is kind of is like looking up. You don't look to the stars and you don't look to your feet, you look ahead of you and not behind you, and you take a step, because the next moment of your history and each part of contingent existence is a step in and with and before ultimacy. And so that finite, historically contingent ground, and at some moment can be seized and become holy ground or holy moments. And that it was like reading that while doing the normal Advent story time with kids at night. I was like, anyway, that was what went through my head this week.
Yeah, and if you really do believe that every moment in time, every finite thing belongs to eternity and to infinity, you don't dwell in despair alone. You're always trying to live in the spirit of expectation without falling into, as you say, utopianism. So you look for signs of the Kairos in the bleakest moments, um, because you live under the power of Kairos, under the power of what he says, elsewhere as political expectation. But and because you don't think that political expectation will be realized only in your churchy buddies, you might look for it at work in the nuclear scientists. That's the amazing thing about that sermon, right? That his willingness to say that effectively Oppenheimer is our and his colleagues who are proclaiming the terror that they have themselves unleashed, to be able to say, look, there is something kairotic happening, something prophetic happening. It's not us that's doing the work. But because he has this hermeneutic that the sacred can show, can show itself in absolutely secular people, whether they will it or not, he holds out this hope, right? And say, but there I see the prophetic at work yet again. And I think that's great. I think that should tutor us to be on the hunt, on a kind of longing, yearning for where God will show God's self. Right here, he's not far from Barth, who can see that the divine might speak itself through a dead dog, um, even though the ontologies are very, very different. Still, I what would it mean to linger in this terrible moment where we're haunted by what's coming for us after January 20th and has already started to realize itself? A kind of political darkness and despair are possible. But if you really believe that God is not done with us, and that other births of new being might emerge, where might we look? How might we steel ourselves from falling prey to despair and yearn for an expectation um, of new Kairoi emerging? I think that will be the question for us in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun, John. Thank you to everyone who joined live, watching later, sending questions and such. There are a number of process Tillich related questions, but there's a whole episode on this about to come out from Theology Beer Camp, where we had quite a bit of fun
Yes.
contrasting the two. I don't know if the format was more fun than just how nerdy it managed to get in a room with that many people in it. But if you've ever wanted to hear a hot take about Middle Schelling's influence on Tillich and the potentials of it creating connections to process thought, then just wait what comes out of my mouth after listening for an hour while drinking. But this has been a complete blast. Everyone, you're welcome to go sign up if you haven't. ohgodwhatnow.net, so you can watch the lecture, and you can all help me lure John to come do a whole class on Tillich with me, because I always have fun talking to you, John.
Oh, I have an absolute blast when hanging out with you. You know, I believe in theology when theology is enacted, not when it's just me sitting in isolation. There's something about encounter which activates theological possibility, and you do it better than just about anyone I know. So wonderful to hang out with you.